I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. And in doing so, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution that Aboriginal Australians have made to our Defence Forces from the very start of the history of our Defence Forces. Last evening, late yesterday afternoon, it was an honour to lay a wreath at the shrine. And it's a privilege again today to be here to commemorate and to give thanks for the RSL's century of service. I wish to acknowledge the work of Admiral Doolan and the leaders and the delegates of the RSL and, of course, your families who support you in your endeavours. I'd like to acknowledge our friends from across the Tasman who are here representing New Zealand veterans. I wish to acknowledge also the presence of the Prime Minister. It is good to be here with the Prime Minister, and it's important that we are both here, not for a moment as leaders of competing parties, but as representatives of a united nation. There won't be many times, I suspect, in the upcoming 4 weeks that we will get the chance to be able to appear together and momentarily, perhaps if you like, not engage in the political and partisan debate, but look backwards over 100 years and look forwards. And it is also pleasing, I might say, that in the current political environment, that there is a complete unity of purpose about matters of defence, about respect and support for the men and women of the Australian Defence Forces serving overseas as we speak, and indeed in our own country, and great support, of course, for matters of veterans. And for a moment, this rancour is stopped, and this is a good thing, and I thank the RSL for performing another service in its centenary. But I also wish to add that I think that last week, perhaps we got it wrong. We perhaps should have been there at Richmond Air Base when 33 Australians were brought home at last from the far corner of a foreign field. And I do acknowledge the work of former Prime Minister Abbott in terms of repatriation. I believe that at any other time outside of an election campaign, we would have been there. I think I can say that, like me, the Prime Minister was concerned that the, the travelling circus of the campaign might have detracted from the dignity of a solemn ceremony. So out of respect, we stayed away and the Governor-General represented the Commonwealth. But I should have realised at the moment the occasion was actually bigger than that, bigger than all of us. And for Vietnam veterans, I wonder if our absence that day inevitably carried that sad echo of a lack of respect from governments past. Perhaps an uncomfortable reminder of the old indignities inflicted on Australians who answered our nation's call. I certainly sure that I speak for the political parties of this country when I say sorry. Friends, 100 years ago, a lieutenant in the 5th Infantry Battalion by the name of George Macon, already a veteran of Lone Pine, wrote home to his family from the Western Front. His letter addressed the unspoken gulf between the new recruits and the old hands. He wrote, "The men who are left of the original expeditionary force now take life more seriously than they did 2 years ago. You cannot see the death, misery and suffering that we have seen and still be the same. But along with 60,000 of his fellow Australians, George would not live to see the end of that devastating war." And that figure alone, 60,000, never truly tells the tale. This was reminded to me most clearly last year. I attended a baptism the week before I attended the Anzac Day Centenary in Turkey. There was an older member of the family tree, Uncle Brian. He told me a story that I'd never heard before about his two uncles who both died at Gallipoli. William Burgess, 23, was killed on the 26th of April 1915. His younger brother Nathaniel, 21, died in November the same year at Gallipoli. As Brian put it to me, the family never recovered. It was 2 generations of loss. he explained what he meant. That the parents never got over the loss of their sons. The marriage simply disintegrated. The mother found herself unable to care for the two surviving daughters, the sisters of William and Nathaniel. They were then placed in foster care. 2 moments in 7 months on the other side of the world damaged a family for 2 generations. This is a story which has been untold for too long, and it's just one from one campaign. Beyond the fallen, hundreds of thousands of Australians would return home wounded or bearing the invisible scars of trauma. And all who served, all who returned, were changed in some way by what they had seen and what they had endured. For that generation and for every generation who followed in their footsteps, things could not be the same. And so often they couldn't find the words to explain why. So often they did not answer the question, what did you do in the war? From this reality, in this silence, the RSL grew. A welcoming place of camaraderie and quiet understanding. A heart and a home in the community for Australians seeking the uncomplicated solidarity of those who knew what it was like. From its very first days, the RSL fulfilled this mission, a mission that no government had turned its mind to. You've reached beyond rehabilitation. You look further than commemoration. You offer, at your core, instead, the comfort of stability, normality, respect, and community. And even as the organisation has grown, diversified and broadened its mission and its ambition to charity, to sport, to social welfare and aged care, that fundamental respect has continued. That unchanging devotion has endured. A century ago, in the aftermath of a war that cost our young nation so many lives, Australia made a promise to remember. Country towns planted seeds which have grown into avenues of honour. Coastal villages quarried white stone for monuments, covered in a roll call where surnames came in 2s and 3s. Sons and brothers who fell, faces to the foe, sometimes on the same day and on the same ground. That tradition of remembering has flourished and endured in a time when so many of the old certainties and old loyalties have faded in our society. The Anzac legend has only grown in resonance and meaning. And it should be a source of tremendous pride to all veterans and their families that today those commemorations are overwhelmingly led and supported by our young people, young Australians here and abroad, gazing up at the steep cliffs of Anzac Cove, shoulder to shoulder in the morning light of Villa Bretonneux, retracing the steep Kokoda track and waiting for dawn at Hellfire Pass. A resurgence of Australian pride from Korea, Vietnam, Malaya, North Africa and the Mediterranean, treading lightly on the ground made hollow by those who died for their country, gathering at the going down of the sun and in the morning to say, lest we forget. But those words, our oldest national promise, have to mean something for those who came home, as well as those who did not. And the uncomfortable truth is that as a nation, we have sometimes been better at honouring the memory of our dead than offering decent support for the living. From soldier settlement schemes that sentence too many families to an incredibly arduous task on unyielding land, to the shameful treatment dealt to those who returned from Vietnam to a country divided. We have not always fulfilled the duty we owe to those that have done theirs. for all the memorials that enrich our landscape. There are no walls covered in poppies for veterans who would later take their own lives. Yet their loss is no less. The sadness of their passing, no smaller. Post-traumatic stress remains poorly understood and inadequately measured. Shockingly, 1 in 10 of our fellow Australians who are homeless is a veteran. Our country owes those who risk their lives in Australia's name better than this. None of us have the right to tell people who were prepared to pay the ultimate price that we cannot afford to care for them. And now, with a new generation of young men and women returning home from Australia's longest war, we must do better, we must do more. We must add to the meaning of our national promise to remember. We owe more than the respect of history or solemn acknowledgement of honoured memory, more than a poppy or a sprig of rosemary or the gleam of a rising sun badge. Our obligation is for practical help, a caring arm and a helping hand for those who come home and better support for their families. Every time we pass an RSL, we should remind ourselves of this responsibility. For 100 years, you, the delegates and leaders of the RSL, have sought to hold governments and parliaments to this national promise. For 100 years, the RSL has reminded Australia of the true meaning of duty and sacrifice. Congratulations on a century of serving those who serve. Long may your work continue, lest we forget.
And that's where we leave Bill Shorten's speech, opposition leader, at the RSL Centenary conference. He also talked about the world in which the RSL came into being in 1916, the world, of course, that Australia was playing its part in World War I, 2 years into the war, still great depths of destruction and damage that war cost to Australia was not fully known. But Bill Shorten mentioned the 60,000 Australians who never saw the end of World War I alive, quite an extraordinary figure. And then the hundreds of thousands who did return home wounded or scars, and he said the RSL helped with their quiet understanding, the uncomplicated solidarity. He did also admit again, he did in his press conference last week, but he admitted that perhaps last week we, as in he and the Prime Minister, got it wrong by not going to the repatriation ceremony for 33 Australians who were brought home. But he did finish off with saying we must do better, we must do more.